Hey folks, welcome back. Today we're doing a lecture on the overhead press. All right, we're going to talk about the basic mechanics of the OHP today. I'm going to give you guys a brief little guide on how to program this for your strength training to blow up your shoulders and get a strong vertical press, which is a nice complement to your bench, and it's a great exercise for your overall shoulder health and mobility. We're going to be going over the muscles that are used, the mechanics, the setup, the stance, the grip, things like that. We're going to try and cover things quickly, succinctly, but I'm going to give you guys lots of tips to get started. So if you've never done this movement before, you're going to have everything you need based on today's lecture. And if you've done this movement before, and you've had shoulder, wrist pain, or you've hit a plateau with your training with regards to strength, well, I'm going to give you guys some tips with your programming to hopefully help you break through those plateaus very, very quickly and consistently. We're also going to cover variations and accessories and different types of bars that you can use for an overhead press. Awesome. Let's get right into it. So the muscles that are used on the overhead press are predominantly your anterior deltoids, which is basically just the front of your shoulder. All right. So that's something that would be used on a front raise, a vertical press, a bench press, things like that, right? Like pressing motions and shoulder isolations are often working the front of the shoulders. The triceps are also being used a lot on the overhead press because we have to do a ton of extension work on the way up in order to get close to lockout. Your upper traps are also helping because as you retract, as you push to get the bar above your head, you're going to be elevating your shoulders at least a little bit. The lower traps are going to be kicking in because as you push pretty much to lock out the last few inches of the range of motion, your lower traps are going to engage to take your shoulder blades, let's say these are your shoulder blades, and pull them down. Your rotator cuff is also working here because again, like the bench press, it's allowing you to stay stable in that position. So there's some active external rotation at the shoulder joint. Then we've got the glutes, the abs, and the grip work that's being done. These are basically just stabilizers. So like we talked about on other videos, when it comes to stabilizer recruitment, it's not necessarily that these muscles would grow a ton from doing the movement itself, but rather they contribute to the force by preventing your force from being leaked through the body and basically creating a rigid kinetic chain and allowing you to be very efficient. So with regards to abs, grip, glutes, these are the difference between having strong and consistent reps that are efficient and being a little bit weaker and inconsistent. It's not necessarily a 20% difference. It's not necessarily a 50% difference, but every percentage that you can get in your favor on heavy compound movement is excellent. For the setup and posture, when you guys are getting set up for the overhead press, what I want you to think about is this. The bar is traveling up towards above your head, right? You're trying to go from here, front rack position, to fully locked out with your arms above your head. But in order to get there, what we need to do is get our head out of the way and move the bar up there in an efficient manner. Now, generally speaking on overhead press, it's not a true and true vertical motion, even if you're standing or sitting without back support. Okay, you're not pushing perfectly up, you're pushing up and back. You need to drive your head through in order to get that position because again, the bar starts here. It's not in line with your spine. It might be close to being in line with your midfoot, but it's not in line with your spine. So in order to get it there, you need to do a couple things. Once you've got that front rack position set up, you need to make sure that you clear your head back. Okay, so you're going to squeeze with your glutes, you're going to get your head back, you're going to push up, and you're going to drive backwards like this. Before you even get into that position, a couple things you want to think about. As far as rack height goes for the overhead press, you might find that a similar height to your squat height is good. So whatever you set your J hooks to on the squat rack that you're using, probably plus or minus 1 would be ideal. Although you'll find often that the exact same height you use for squatting is perfect for overhead press. You want to bend down a little bit to get into it. Use your knees to help you pick up the bar, but you don't want to be bending down too far, and you don't want to have to really do a lot of work pressing a heavy weight out of it, doing like a partial rep and then taking your 2 steps back. As far as grip, close grip feels pretty good, and I think a lot of people will tell you that. And so you don't need to go wide here. Generally speaking, from my experience, what I can tell is this. On a bench press, wide grip is stronger, close grip is weaker. On overhead press, it tends to be the opposite. Wide grip is weaker, close grip is stronger. And people talk about getting your joints stacked so your arm isn't quite perfectly vertical, but the closer it is to vertical in your starting position, the front rack position, the better off your press is going to be. So as far as grip width goes, maybe just get your first knuckle like just in line with your shoulder or just outside your shoulder.
Basically, just a couple little tips is, one, you're going to grip relatively narrow. I think that for the strict press, generally speaking, whatever grip width leads to your forearm being straight up and down in the bottommost position is usually a pretty good point to start.
Now, as far as grip goes, you can take advantage of a suicide grip. Some people will find that allows them to feel more powerful. Personally, I'm able to wrap it so that way the side of my thumb is bending into the bar. You want to squeeze hard into it, like you're really trying to crush and bend the bar.
I do want you squeezing that barbell as hard as possible because like I mentioned in every other video, guys, your body works synergistically. If you're squeezing that barbell, you will get more power output. If you don't believe it, just try it.
As far as your steps, once you get your grip, you're going to take only a couple steps. Okay, don't take 3 or 4 and do a little shuffle like a squat. You want to be rigid as soon as you get that bar out of the rack. So in order to maintain that tightness, you're going to take 2 really conscious, really firm steps backwards. You just want a little bit of room away from the rack. It's okay if you're fairly close. You're not going to hit the rack if you take a couple steps back, even if they aren't huge steps. As far as the wrist goes, again, what we want to avoid more than anything is just this. So it's okay if you use a suicide grip. It's okay if you go like this, but it would be better to have the bar stacked over the wrist, just like we talked about in the bench press video, than to have this position. Air is so important, right? Breathing and bracing. You know, we talk about taking that deep breath in. Valsalva maneuver, you got to hold your breath under load, especially when your spine's under load in order to be strong, right? To prevent your core from being jelly. Well, that is absolutely important here. And so you need to take a huge breath in before you get under the rack. And as you're doing your reps, you should do at least a few reps. Let's say on a set of 8 or 10, you should at least do the first several reps without letting your air out. And then the best place to take air in is at the top in the lockout position. Not ideal to take it down here at the bottom.
From here, as you go to drive up, you're going to get your chin out of the way so that you don't go to the dentist. Chin out of the way.
Have you done that before?
Yeah.
The biggest thing though, really guys, is that you need to clear your head and you need to push up and back. So get yourself into a position that will allow you to do that fairly efficiently, fairly naturally feeling. And it's okay if your setup's a little bit different than mine. As far as the mechanics of the exercise itself goes, what we're going to look at first is just some drawings of what the setup looked like. So what this person is doing here, you can see in the drawing, just like we talked about, the bar is basically set up to be very close to their shoulder height. Maybe I drew that a little bit high, but you only want to have to bend your knees a little bit to get into position. And as far as person here, 2 steps, maybe 3 at the most, but really you should be taking like a conscious 1, 2, and then boom, you're set up. As far as the bar path goes, what you can see here, this person is squeezing their butt and they're extending through their thoracic spine. So if you are able to do this, you're going to basically tilt yourself back. So not only you can clear your head, but you can push more effectively because the deltoids are very, very strong. They work really hard, not only when we push vertically, but when we're slightly on an angle. So we're in a sense, we're taking a vertical motion and making it like an incline press, a very high incline, but an incline press essentially. And that's a strong position. And then you want to lock this exercise out. Lockout is not optional. I don't care if you've heard videos saying lockout's going to wear out your joints.
This locking out in between reps can actually allow you to do more reps per set, not fewer.
On this motion, in order to have a little rest and a break at the top position, you need to go to full lockout. And in order to fully work your triceps and your shoulders, fully work the musculature, you need to go to lockout. Again, remember, we even talked about smaller muscles like the rotator cuff and the lower trap. They're going to get more work if you do the movement properly, which is from below your chin to above lockout, to above in a fully locked out position. You should look like this. You should look like a stick where the bar is not only above your head, but it's towards the back. In fact, it's okay if the bar is even behind your head. Both of those are great positions. It doesn't have to be in the middle of your head. Okay, now moving on to some variations. What you're going to notice is that sometimes with straight barbell, it can be a little bit rough on the wrists for pushing motions, especially as you get stronger. When you're a beginner, you're not going to find that like sub 100 pound weights on benches and overhead presses really do much to your wrists. But when you start to climb into the hundreds and, the 200s for like your working sets, yeah, you're going to want to, carefully consider how you get your wrist set up. And you'll see people use wrist wraps, which are perfectly fine, perfectly reasonable to do. But one of the biggest advantages of specialty bars is that for pressing motions, you can get your wrist into a little bit more individualized position, right? Depending on your wrist width, strength, stability, whether you've had injuries, sprains, fractures in the past. I have one wrist that's a little bit better than the other one, fractured one, sprained the other at another point. So if you're like me and you have some injuries, sometimes you struggle getting into a good position that doesn't irritate soft tissue. If that's the case, then I think you would strongly consider specialty bars as a main variation, or the very least an accessory, to push some joint-friendly volume. But before we jump into those, let's go over the straight bar, the power bar, and Olympic bar, you can call it. You can use those terms interchangeably. Basically, the straight bar variations. So what we have here, aside from the regular standing one where you get it from the squat rack, there's the seated variation where you're actually resting your back against the seat. This allows you to be very, very strong because it eliminates a lot of the stability work, and you can set the incline to basically just below vertical, right? Like one click away from vertical, and you're already in the correct position basically for your build. And you're already, just like we're talking about, squeezing the glutes, taking the big breath in, cocking or puffing our chest out to get our shoulders in that position where it's an incline press. You're already doing that in the seated variation. So it's a very, very stable movement that's less taxing on the stabilizers and allows you to be really, really strong. Now, you do get a little bit less scapular freedom. So if you have any shoulder concerns or underdeveloped rotator cuff, maybe just in general, you've got some issues going on in your shoulder, whether that's rotator cuff, impingements, things like that, you might find that the natural motion of allowing your shoulder blades to move up, back, and then squeezing down, which they will when you have scapular freedom on an unsupported variation, whether that's sitting or standing, it'll be nicer to actually engage the traps more, engage the rotator cuff more. But if you're someone with really, really good shoulders, you'll probably find that going heavy on the seated OHP with back support is such a fantastic way to push those big weights. And then when we look at the no back support version, this is more of a self-limiting variation. So typically it's much harder to get leg drive sitting down. One way you can ensure that you get some leg drive, if you so choose to use it, is to have, just like on the bench press, we were talking about the heel or the ball of the toe, wherever you're pushing into the ground, being behind your knee and also behind your hip. So it's somewhere in the middle to allow you to push efficiently straight down into the ground. So that way you're pushing up. Well, just like on the bench press, if we apply that to the seated variation, you're going to be able to get a solid leg drive. Usually people are weaker on this variation. For me, I'm surprised how close my standing and seated non-back support variation are. I think I've gotten really good at using leg drive on the seated, and I also have really good thoracic mobility, so that might just be unique to me, but with some practice, I think you'll find your seated OHP not only blows up your shoulders and just gets your upper back really jacked, but that overall, there's less of a disparity as you get better at that stabilization work, and a little bit more mobility in your thoracic spine. So this is more of a self-limiting variation. This is more of a heavy variation. And then we have the Z press, which is even harder, right? So easiest, a little bit harder, very hard, right? You're gonna have to go a lot lighter. Okay, your working sets are gonna have to be like 20, 30 pounds lighter on the Z press, more than likely at a minimum, because you're removing all legs whatsoever and you're taxing the core a ton, even more than the sitting down version without back support. I would generally speaking recommend the same grip width for pretty much all overhead press variations, including the specialty bars. But basically, yeah, with the Z press, you just want to make sure you get your setup right. So play around with how close your hips are to the rack. You don't want to have to move very much to get the bar in and out of the rack. And if you start to fall over, make sure you do it as safely as possible, right? Okay, don't get crushed under the bar, right? If you're doing this exercise, you should be using those bumpers so that way you have enough height to clear your head if, heaven forbid you ever have a little whoopsie incident with the Z press. But otherwise, very safe, very effective, almost like a bodybuilding variation where you're getting a ton of shoulder stimulus, just like the Romanian deadlift has a great stimulus fatigue ratio, so does the Z press. Okay, and as far as specialty bars go, one of my favorite specialty bars for overhead press is the Easy Curl bar. And why this is such a great tool for overhead press is that for people who are beginners, or like I was talking about earlier, have bad wrists. So if you have some serious issues like arthritis and sprains and things like that, this is going to allow you to get into probably a nicer, more natural feeling position because there's the curves. Generally speaking, that's a little bit easier on the wrist, although not for everyone. And because this is a little bit lighter of a bar, right? It's not generally 45 pounds. Curling bars might be 10, 14, 15, 20 pounds. I think sometimes you can find some that are like 30 pounds, but generally speaking, a curling bar is like 20 pounds or less. So especially for like older folks, people who are absolute beginners, especially for females, if they're towards the beginner side, it's important that they're going to start with less than 45 pounds for that pressing motion. On that note, really quick, you can also use 35 pounds, 6 foot, power bars. That's another option if someone's not strong enough to rep out the empty bar as a starting place. But either way, you can take this and load it up with like 5-10 pounds on each side, and you can use that to build your way up to the power bar. Or again, you can just use it because if that feels really nice for your wrists, this is still a perfectly valid way to train. A couple considerations are just that you're going to have to figure out a setup where it's narrow enough for you to put it in a rack, or you're going to have to use a weight that's light enough that you can just clean it and comfortably get into that front rack position. Probably what you'll have to do is stick to a little bit higher of a rep range, like 8 to 12, and not really go lower if you're planning on cleaning the weight up, maybe even do even higher reps. But either way, Easy Curl bar is a fantastic variation. For the Swiss bar, often this is easier on the shoulders and wrists. It's a little bit more natural and a strong of a position. It just sort of reinforces. So rather than go from this, you can go to this, right? Just a little bit more abduction, right? With a neutral wrist position, you're going to find that stacking the joints right off the bat is easier to get into, and you don't find as much clicking and popping in this position. If you guys have clicking and popping, generally it's because you're not opening up in the right time. So as you're pushing up, you need to find your sweet spot where you're opening up your shoulders. You're using that scapular plane, because if you just stay in the locked in position, yeah, you're going to have difficulty, doing a pain-free, click-free pressing motion. So you're going to have to experiment with when you push up and get your shoulders out. It's going to be a little bit different for each of you, but generally speaking, as you get the bar to your head, your shoulders should be more flared out and you're puffing your chest out. On the Swiss bar, you're going to find that that's easier to deal with. You're going to have to use less weight, generally speaking, because the bar is cocked out. It's forward. It's preventing you from getting it, towards your neck and midline of your spine. So you can tilt it up a little bit to help you push. And as you can see here in this clip, you can go really heavy safely on the Swiss bar OHP. It's an excellent, excellent variation. Very humbling, much like a Larson press or a close grip bench. Then there's the trap bar, very similar. This one's a little bit more awkward to set up, but if you get going with some light weights, high reps, you'll find that this neutral grip, and same thing with the shoulder freedom, right? You're gonna find that this is a very, very joint friendly variation, and is a great way to accumulate some volume. Alok Ankiri is a huge fan of this one, and he's getting a pretty strong press. I think he's working towards a 2-plate press this year, perhaps. And so just to sum it up, these are all great variations / accessories, right? So the seated OHP, a little bit of a self-limiting variation, less weight, okay, less leg drive involvement. For the seated one, that's for the non-back supported seated one. For the seated one with back support, you're going to be really, really strong without necessarily taxing the stabilization the same way. Here, you still have a lot of stabilization in your core, but you're using less weight, so it's a little bit more joint friendly, and it's a very humbling variation. Swiss bar, trap bar / hex bar, we just covered those. The push press, this is a nice one as well. You can use it sort of as like a litmus test to push yourself up to a heavy weight. Let's say you've never done a 200-pound overhead press. Well, if you work your way up to a 200-pound push press, you'll know that you're only probably months away at the most from being able to do a 200-pound OHP. And you can even experiment with using less legs as you practice it. So in that scenario where you're using the push press to get really heavy, really strong, and test how much weight you can lock out in the top position, you can do half of your volume spent as a push press, or even just one set a couple times a week, just to even play around with some heavy weights, sets of 5, something like that. It's a very fatiguing motion, so don't do high rep push press. But either way, it's going to allow you to play around with some weights, get good at locking them out before you're strong enough to get them all the way up without a ton of leg drive. Behind the neck press is a lot safer than you think. So Athlete X videos and all kinds of other videos, they talk about this like high five position, right, being really dangerous. Not necessarily, although some people are a little bit more built for it than others. People like Sam Sheethar have done some really impressive things with the behind the neck press. So don't discount this one. It's a tough variation, really hard on the deltoids, and not necessarily dangerous. Z press, we already covered that. And as far as like low specificity movements go, which is what I call accessories, rope push downs, incline bench, dumbbell OHP, shrugs, and front raises are all excellent ways to get your deltoids jacked and just to overall work the musculature that you need for your strong overhead press. Then on to the strength guide. So basically, I would say this. Managing your fatigue on the overhead press is very important, although it can be a very grindable exercise. Let's think about what happens if you go to failure on overhead press. You get maybe up to your forehead, maybe even less. You don't have enough gas. You know you don't have enough gas to get there. You're sitting there for 2-3 seconds. It's not moving. You bring it down to the front rack position. You put it down. You take a rest. You take some weight off. It's not a big deal. It's very safe compared to something like taking a squat or a bench press. You don't need a spotter, and probably the injury risk associated with going to failure overhead press is much lower. And as far as like the spine goes, yes, it might feel a little uncomfortable to have, you know, hyperextension in your thoracic spine and where the thoracic spine meets the lumbar, and if there's some extension going on the lumbar spine. But other than the first few times you use a heavy weight, you might feel a little discomfort. You're probably not going to blow a disc out doing overhead press. So it's very, very safe. But if you spend most of your time training like RP 8, even 7, and then limiting yourself to like, you know, 1 rep shy of failure, so 1 rep in reserve / RP 9, that's probably a good way to ensure that you have quality reps and therefore quality sets, which, as you guys know, we talk about here at Smart Simple Fit. Quality sets and quality reps is what matters in the long run if you're trying to get big and strong. So as far as programming goes, once in a while, experiment with some triples and some 5s. But again, those need to be sub-maximal. You need to have a couple in reserve. Most of your time should be spent probably grinding out like 6 to 15 reps, even 6 to 12, you can narrow it down. So you might want to go a little bit lighter on this movement than you might on, say, bench, deadlift, or squat, but you can still handle some pretty heavy weights and not get too beat up. As far as sets per week go, I would say like 6 to 10 is plenty. And you're going to need to program more than 1 day of overhead press.
You gotta up the frequency, man. Once you're past the early beginner stages, this lift is simply not going to budge if you're only training it 1 time per week. And that just is what it is.
In the beginning, 1 day of overhead press with 3 or 4 sets might be enough to get a big response. But as you get stronger, you're going to need to tax those deltoids more. They recover very fast, and they can really take the beating even if you're doing a horizontal press a couple times a week, right? So 6 to 10 sets per week, divide it up however you want, whether that's frequency of 2 or 3, that's none of my business, but you don't have to go crazy. You don't have to do 20 sets. Full range of motion is absolutely king. Okay, that is key to getting jacked on the overhead press. Don't do these half rep type things, all right? Take advantage of going below your chin and all the way up to lockout. Otherwise, that's it, guys. I know this might be a little bit of a nerve-wracking exercise, might look a little bit sketchy, or you might be worried about dropping a weight on your head, but you know what? It's going to be your instinct not to hit yourself in the face. So as long as you get your head out of the way, you control that weight when it's above your head with intent, focused reps, you're going to be just fine. Okay, so give this one a try. This is one of the greatest upper body strength exercises ever. It's completely essential. You'll get a lot more out of using the bar than just exclusively using dumbbells, although those work pretty good too. So if you want to be strong and do a fun exercise that makes you feel tough, go ahead and try out the barbell OHP using the tips that we discussed today. Leave a comment, let me know how it goes. See you guys in the next one.